Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the clash of ancient times and modern times, right here, the next hour, where civilizations meet.
Come on in, everybody.
That's right.
Good morning, good afternoon.
It just became afternoon.
Good morning, good evening, and good night. That's what.
Rabbi Eshel.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, I loved your talk last week about Kabbalah and Hasidism, and I still don't get it.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the point.
The truth is, Lori, neither do we. We just
totally hidden.
We just talk about it.
It's totally hidden until it is revealed. Ooh,
the people like Madonna.
Here they come. Oh, look. It's Jeff.
Hello.
Merle, hello.
Hey, Merle.
Hi.
Your favorite nemesis is back.
Definitely.
Oh, give me a break.
You're right up there with me, Merle. Seriously.
Okay.
Now, remember, we're on live television.
Yeah. Oh my God.
That's right.
I think he's trying to compliment me.
I
was.
Think so. I was.
No question.
Seriously.
No question.
Don't forget, these people have known me for a long time, Jeff.
Is that an advantage for me or a disadvantage?
I think it depends on the day.
Yeah.
Depends
Or
on
the
the
moment.
hour.
All I know is that we men have to stick together. We're grossly outnumbered.
Roy, I feel like your angle is different.
It is. I shifted. I moved my desk.
Oh,
so you're seeing
okay.
Another bookshelf.
You're throwing me off a little, dude.
I do that deliberately. Threw you a curve. You're expecting a fastball.
I was going to say, he
There are many
rearranged
angles. There are
himself.
many angles in life. Yes.
I got to show off the library.
Well, I can always count on Phyllis and Warren, though, to be like in the exact picture like this. This is like the picture. It's like it could even be just a background. Like it's just like they put up their picture and be like, yeah,
Right.
it's perfect.
I never move.
I do have a question that I hope you guys will answer in the course of our discussion is, does
Doubtful.
excommunication exist in Judaism?
Oh, well, you know what? That is a fabulous, interesting question that actually comes up in something that I am going to talk about. I can't even believe it. I can't. Yes.
The two of you have a pre-show meeting.
No,
We didn't. Set up.
In that Steinberg book about Rabbi Abuya, he was threatened with excommunication out of Palestine and began his travels.
Yeah.
get out of here.
I think the short answer is it absolutely exists as a measure, as a legal measure. I think it's rarely actually been used, but I will tell you, if you want to read up on it, check out Baruch Spinoza, the Jewish philosopher who was also threatened with excommunication because of his, crazy non-Jewish ideas and philosophy, and it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, and a version of it actually comes up in 1962 in a case in Israel, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, fascinating.
But welcome, everybody. Cantor, Gurney, this is so fun for me to be on the screen with you. You are all in for a treat to be here with Cantor, Gurney.
Likewise, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Claudia, is that a martini you just poured for yourself?
You wish. No, it's a sad
you wish.
glass of water.
No, you wish.
you wish. Why would I wish that?
Well, I wish. No. About 6 hours.
Ah, nice.
So
I love a woman with goals. Seriously.
That's right. Yeah. It's interesting, you know, the family who owned that painting, by the way, who rightfully owned that painting, the woman in gold, actually lived just a few blocks from me here in Cheviot Hills.
Oh, really?
Really?
Yes. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was a good movie. It was actually quite suspenseful.
Well, the attorney, I got to know pretty well because his daughter and my daughter played basketball together.
Wow.
In middle school at Harvard Westlake. This is Randy Schoenberg. He was the legal representation for them.
Have you read the book about it?
Pardon me?
Have you read the book about it, Rabbi Eshel? Or
I saw the movie.
the book's excellent.
Didn't a lot of that money go to establishing the Skirball Center?
I don't know.
I don't think so. I think Skirball was around for a number of years before that case was actually decided. Yeah.
I know the money went to a charitable organization or structure or museum or whatever in Los Angeles because
It could have been LA Moth.
Oh, could have been LA Moth.
Because Schoenberg was on the board. Yeah.
That's
yeah.
I think
good one. Good one.
I don't think it went to Skirp.
LA Moth.
Yeah.
But could we also just take a moment to appreciate Mark's fabulous hair? Mark, my goodness, I am impressed. He's taken like the COVID non-haircut to a next level.
Having a doctor wife, she hasn't let me have a haircut since February 17th.
Dude, it's looking good, man.
That's
Like that's a new look. I'd go with that.
67 years old and I'm going back to high school.
That's right.
Dude.
Well, I'll tell you, my wife and daughter hated my long hair so much by the time it was like mid-April that they cut my hair on the front patio 3 times. And then they allowed me to have my barber come and do it, you know, in the backyard. But,
I want to know what they all think about it.
right.
You're lucky you have earlobes.
Right.
I don't even know what that means, Jeff, but okay. That's a fabulous segue. That's a fabulous
Everybody
segue.
wants to be a surgeon.
Explain it.
I want to know what they think of I don't know the Shayans. With Shayans? What they all think of the merger?
All right.
Maybe at the
So Rav Eshel.
Yes. So this
we?
is fabulous. So, here comes Susan Ehrlich. You can't begin anything. You can't begin without Susan. We can't begin without Susan.
That's right.
Here she comes.
He's hiding.
Where is she? Where is she? Where is she? There she comes.
Susan.
On my screen. There she is on my screen. Susan, I said we couldn't start without you. So now that you're here, fabulous. Now we can begin.
Hi, Susan.
So when Cantor, Gurney, and I were discussing this this class, we decided we were going to pivot a bit on the topic, right? Because it's talking about religious and secular, or religious and civil law, and where do we stand on certain things.
like
But but in our movement, right? In our movement, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Cantor, Gurney, we very much, the law of the land is the law, and there were a couple of interesting things that we thought we could go with whether it was abortion, whether it was marriage, whether it's divorce, but we thought that maybe it would be more interesting, an opportunity for us to talk about things that we see in our everyday lives that very much connect to who we are as progressive Jews, and certain prohibitions that may be halachic versus a more progressive and civil secular understanding of the topic. And specifically, what we thought to cover today was, music on Shabbat and playing instruments on Shabbat and in the sanctuary and that kind of stuff. And correct me if I'm wrong, Cantor, Gurney. And the next one, this idea of matrilineal, patrilineal descent, who is a Jew, who is not a Jew, what does that even mean? How do we, is this something that is, from Sinai, or did it evolve over time, and all of those kind of wonderful things. So, the topics do blend themselves nicely together, but we figured this would be a more interesting opportunity or thing to discuss. Cantor, Gurney, maybe you could, I didn't really explain that as well as I probably could have, but Cantor Gurney is much more articulate than I can ever hope to be.
Some of what I'm about to share with you, those who, some of my regulars for Music Matters, some of it will be a little bit of a repeat, but not too much. So, as Rabbi Eshel mentioned, the meeting point of music and Shabbat with Jewish law, which dates to antiquity, and our contemporary understanding of what is permissible and even
like
desired.
no music during Passover.
Well, that is one particular piece of it, but the origins of this prohibition against music are fascinating and do date back to ancient times, but not until we reach a certain point in our history. So let's begin quickly, a history sketch. The ancient temple is established sometime in the 9th century BCE, and for the next nearly 1,000 years, until it is ultimately destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, within that temple there was a deeply, I should say, deep and long-standing musical culture. In the ancient temple, you had the Kohanim and the Leviim, the priests and the Levites. They were, for lack of a better term, the federal government of ancient Israel, and the seat of that government was the ancient temple. And within that temple, there was music. Music accompanied the entire ritual experience that was conducted in that ancient temple for close to 1,000 years. The Kohanim, the priests, led those ceremonies, and the Levites were the temple musicians. We know that there was a temple orchestra and a temple choir, each one separately numbering anywhere from 12 to 36 singers and musicians. That means it was quite sophisticated.
Whoa, 36 musicians and 36 singers?
They were separate. You had a choir and musicians separate. Anywhere, any different combinations of up to 36 musicians and or 36 singers in different combinations. That musical tradition lasted for nearly 1,000 years.
How often did they do that?
Yeah. Well, basically, all the time. There were temple ceremonies in the ancient temple, weekday sacrifices, right, and Shabbat, right? So this is pre-halacha, temple singers and musicians. They played instruments. We know that mostly the instruments were of a plucked string nature, as well as some percussion and some primitive woodwind instruments. Okay? So this is a musical tradition that lasts for many, many centuries, and it became cultivated and sophisticated. The singers and the musicians were trained. They went through a period of training from 3 to 5 years. So they were trained in the sense not of being paid, but professional musicians. It wasn't open to anyone. You had to be a Levite. So sophisticated music accompanied the ancient temple rituals for nearly 1,000 years. Here's where things get interesting. In and around the 2nd century or so of BCE, you have a new political organization, grassroots, who would become known as the Rabbis. I'm not talking about Rabbi Eshel, a rabbi leader. I'm talking about the Rabbis. Okay, This was a grassroots, progressive, anti-government swelling of political action. And they were opposed to the restrictive and stranglehold on government that the Kohanim and the Levites had in the ancient temple. Right? Eventually, other terms to describe them, the Pharisees were the rabbis. The Sadducees represented the temple cult. Now, it's interesting to know that Christianity turns those two terms on their heads. They label the Pharisees as the evil ones who were responsible for the death of Jesus, who actually came from the ranks of the Pharisees. It is largely agreed upon by modern Jewish scholars and Christian scholars as well that Jesus grew up and was born out of the Pharisaic Rabbi movement. Okay? Now, here's what happens. You have these warring political factions for a long time, and the Pharisaic movement had no greater ambition than to destroy the temple and obliterate even the memory of its institutions. The first of which, and the most important one of which, well, other than sacrifices, not so bad, was the temple music. And so they write into the halakha, you can no longer play instruments on the Sabbath. And you can't even carry instruments on the Sabbath. Their goal, again, was to obliterate the ritual and therefore musical tradition of the priestly cult. And for the most part, they succeeded. They succeeded. We know, other than what instruments were probably used, we have no idea what the music sounded like. We never will. Obviously, it wasn't written down. And with the destruction of the temple and the laws prohibiting the playing of musical instruments, that tradition eventually died out because it was no longer allowed. And after a few generations, it's gone. Right? And those laws prohibiting the playing of instruments, even the carrying of instruments on Shabbat, exist to our own time. Right? You will not hear any of those instruments played on Shabbat in any non-liberal synagogue. Of course, for those of us who grew up either in the liberal conservative or the Reform movement, we don't even think about it, right? It's natural. For most, I would even, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking to myself, when I first came to Wilshire Boulevard Temple 20 years ago, there was no music in any services other than the piano or organ. That was the tradition, right? So in our own time, we had this clash of ancient, not with the ancient temple, but with the next 2,000 years of Jewish history, which forbade the use of musical instruments and the playing of them, and even the carrying of them. So the rabbis of the Talmud went to great lengths to make sure, right? This is the dark underbelly of the tradition. They had a political goal here, right? It wasn't about disrupting the spirituality and shutting down everything on Shabbat. There was a very powerful political and practical reason why these laws came into being, right? And having grown up myself in a liberal conservative synagogue in Cleveland, it was very interesting how they dealt with this issue in the 50s and 60s. Right?
Yeah, can you talk more about the evolution of how did it start coming back? Where did it start coming back? When did it start coming back?
Sure.
Tell me about the different denominations, and even just singing, like, a choir in traditional shuls. Is there even going to be a choir? Like, I know that, in when I was in
Yes.
high school, and friends who go to the South African Orthodox shul, they have these beautiful men's choirs. So can you talk about how all of that started to
Exactly
return?
right. So again, it's one of the things that in time after the destruction of the temple came back because it didn't have to deal with the laws regarding the playing of instruments or carrying them. You use your voice. And there's no doubt that it took hold in Europe, in the what we would consider now to be the Orthodox world. There was only one synagogue world until, the early 19th century with the birth of Reform Judaism in Germany and other places and the emancipation, right? But that's where it begins, in the Reform movement. And in many of the countries, in Germany first, and in Austria, and in France, in order to be considered part of the state, the Jewish community had to adhere to certain rules. And when it came to the synagogue, the government was very concerned and interested and very involved in what went on in the temples. And so much so that when we think about composers like Lewandowski and Sulzer, they were the composers of the 19th century, both in Vienna and in Berlin. The state had a vested interest in the synagogues and Jews in those synagogues to comport themselves in accordance with the decorum of the church. And that meant the playing of an organ, that their music should be composed. And it's the first time in our history where we have music being written down for a whole community to sing and to share. And that meant you had to read music. So it assumes the education of a community, that they become musically literate, right? So when we see these photographs of the former great, magnificent synagogues all over Europe, much bigger than Wilshire Boulevard Temple, by the way, with massive pipe organs, right? They, like we when we came to America, wanted to become more like the dominant culture. So the music reflects that as well. You had many non-Jewish composers writing music for the synagogue in these main centers all over Europe. So in those cities in the 19th century, you have this, again, a huge clash, far more divisive than today, between the early Reform temples, the big ones, and everybody else in what was the traditional mode. But as you mentioned, David, even the traditional synagogue, many of those synagogues, the Orthodox ones had big male choirs. No mixed singing, but male choirs. Even in the early decades of the Reform movement, the choirs at first were all men, right? They were boys and men. That evolved over time to include women as well, right? So it's a fascinating lens to look at the evolution of a number of things: music in the temple, the kind of music, education in the community, women's rights within Jewish life, right? It's a way of looking at and seeing all of those important issues, right? To our own day, where pretty much anything goes musically in any synagogue, not even the instruments. Yeah.
And any synagogue, like, I feel yes in reforms in like a reform or progressive setting, but
yes,
like in the conservative world, isn't there like some that may feel one way? And so what, like, how do they deal with that?
The right-wing conservative are still adhere to those laws. You will not hear music like that in the synagogue, in the right-wing conservative movement. By the way, that particular issue and other related issues is what kind of created a huge split at the Jewish Theological Seminary. This is about 15 years ago, where you had the liberalists there in battle with the traditionalists, and a number of the traditionalists actually left the seminary over issues like this, right? So you'll see in a city like ours, Sinai Temple, which is a member of the conservative movement, with instruments and all kinds of stuff on Shabbat. You can go to any number of other traditional or conservative synagogues where they just don't allow that. So it's kind of a case by case basis, right? So my synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio, which was 2,400 members back then, Friday night was showtime in the main sanctuary, organ, choir. We also did special services with chamber orchestras. For that synagogue's 100th anniversary, I remember it because I was a kid and I sang in it. We had the Cleveland Orchestra in the sanctuary, in performance, right? We did
Is that kind of like what inspired you to bring L.A. Phil to the temple? When you did that?
Without a doubt, because I knew it could be done.
Yeah.
Right? We did, with the Cleveland Orchestra, we did the Cleveland premiere, and this is a big, sophisticated music city. We did the Cleveland premiere of the Chichester Psalms of Bernstein. And I was the boy alto soloist, and that's how I remember those moments. So I saw with my own eyes and experienced, wow, look what you can do in a synagogue. It's pretty spectacular, right? So that's just a kind of a thumbnail sketch of, yes,
I think we have a question. We got a couple questions. Here we go.
So we came to Wilshire when I was 5 in 1956, and there was obviously already the big organ and piano, depending on where you were.
By the way, Earl, I would point out to all of you that sanctuary was built to encase that organ.
So my question is how much sooner before that did music like what I had growing up and what we still have, how much before 56, say, did it start?
Long before that. Obviously in Germany, it had begun by the middle of the 19th century. In America, when the huge influx of the German Jewish community, both from Austria and Germany, came to the United States in the 1880s.
Okay, thank you.
And you all know that Wilshire Boulevard Temple, Congregation B'nai B'rith, was originally established as an Orthodox synagogue. Orthodox synagogue for about the first 15 or 20 years.
You knew that.
Remember, it was established in Wilshire Boulevard Temple, Congregation B'nai B'rith, was established in 1862. After the influx of the German Jews in the 1880s, it changed its and held on to its name, Congregation B'nai B'rith, really until the 1930s, when they just gave up because anyone who went there would just say, the temple on Wilshire Boulevard. They never used the Hebrew name, right? So they just renamed it Wilshire Boulevard. But we have breastplates on the Torahs in the Ark at the sanctuary that were dedicated to the temple in the 1930s, and it says Congregation B'nai B'rith on the back is the family's name.
Wow, I never realized that.
Yeah.
Cool.
I was going to say it was very interesting this year with the high holidays, and also that it became on Shabbat, because 3 different services, besides watching Wilshire Boulevard, 3 different services were televised on the television. So the first one was the Central Synagogue in New York, and I thought, if I'm wrong, it looked a lot like Wilshire Boulevard. The second one was Sinai Temple with a lot of music, but the third one was like the Cantor you're saying. It was a Orthodox synagogue in the Hamptons in New York, and it was a men's choir like you just, but it had been pre-recorded. But it was really great to see all of that and a lot of music.
Oh, absolutely. To your point about Central Synagogue, it's a magnificent, beautiful synagogue, but architecturally doesn't look like Wilshire Boulevard Temple at all. Actually, it's a totally different, side balconies, and it's a longer, more narrow sanctuary.
It was hard to make the distinction on TV, but exactly. If we're ever in New York, I'll go look.
It's a glorious, gorgeous synagogue. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Of course.
I taught at Silver Temple in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes.
I was wondering if it was the same architect that did the Wilshire Temple.
Oh, that's a good
very
question.
much the same.
That's
Yeah.
a good question. It was not. It was not, but the same era.
Okay.
And all
Nina,
these
why
great
do you even
synagogues.
know that?
Because I was 21
That's
when I
right.
went to Cleveland,
Yeah.
and my first job was right away teaching at Silver Temple.
Oh my goodness.
Taught there for 10 years, got an award. I had a dispute regarding a salary because we just formed the Hebrew Teachers Union at the place.
Oh my.
And I dared him to raise that was his son, Daniel. The father was an unbelievable man. He worked the halls with such great presence, but such a humble behavior, very gentlemanlike. And that was, he was his personality. He
Oh, my
spoke to
goodness.
Oh, he
you.
was.
Panina is speaking about Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver.
That's
Yeah.
right. And I lived, our first apartment in Israel, Cantor, was on Abba Hillel Street Road in Ramat Gan.
That's fascinating.
So, yeah. So, but his son, he died, and his son said no.
Rabbi Daniel Jeremy
Yeah.
Silver.
So I said, okay, I'm leaving. So after I left, he raised the salary for the other teachers.
Well, good work on your part.
To your
I
point,
went to the Cleveland Hebrew School and taught there for 47 years.
Wow.
And then the college. I was
47,
teaching at the college too.
So you had a short stint there. About the architecture, we should all know that most of the great synagogues, the older ones now, were built within a period of 6 years in the United States, from 1923 to 1929. Not only synagogues, but churches. This was the public works projects under Roosevelt. Most of the great old churches and synagogues were built during that period. Temple on the Heights, right? And Silver's Temple. By the way, you notice how in those days the temples, they abandoned their Hebrew names, the Reform temples. It became known as Silver's Temple because it was Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver.
That's right.
They also eliminated from the Siddur the sentence that says L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim.
That's right. Yeah.
They took it off the Siddur.
Yes.
I have a question.
Well, I think, let's hold on. Let's get Jeff. Was waiting very patiently.
Okay.
Very impressive. Can we all just take a moment to notice how impressive that was, that he waited patiently, everybody. So maybe
it's
really
so
next year
wonderful,
in Jerusalem.
Rabbi, to be loved so dearly. Honestly,
right, Jeff, then Susan,
my heart
go.
is just throbbing in my chest. Seriously. Just two
Jeff,
comments
then
going
Susan,
back
go.
to the very beginning of the historical rendition of our tradition, so to speak, musically.
Yeah.
Remember when the instructions for the Mishkan were made, they also had instructions for 7 golden horns to be made and played in the temple. And even before that, the story of Miriam at the sea and the timbrels
That's right.
and other instruments were part of the communal experience of the people at that time and would have been carried forward in the social settings. So music, the horns, timbrels, other instruments were an integral part of the service of the Mishkan. And it, stems from there, in a sense, almost an instruction from God to share that joy of music.
There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Susan.
Yes, my question is maybe a little off the track, but I heard Abba Hillel.
This whole thing is off the track. What are you talking about?
I want to know more about
on the musical
Hillel
track.
Silver. I have read some about him and his alliance with Stephen S. Weiss for the creation of Israel, and then they split. So tell me what you know about him.
I can just share a few things. There may be others who know much more about him. I did become friendly with his son, Daniel Jeremy Silver. I studied, took a couple of Jewish history classes with him. He was a brilliant scholar, by the way.
Really?
And has a wonderful 2-volume Jewish history that he did with Professor Bernard Martin. But anyway, Abba Hillel, as you mentioned, was one of the leading rabbis of his time. He did address the world at the United Nations on behalf of the creation of the State of Israel. He was a towering figure. He also, by the way, he kept a kosher home. Not because he himself observed kashrut, but he did it for his colleagues and friends in the Orthodox world, so that when they came to his home, that they would feel comfortable eating. I know that, I learned that from his son, Daniel. So he was a towering orator, much like Stephen Wise. If you ever have a chance to go back and listen to some of their addresses, boy, you would be just entranced. They were, orators from another time. So that much I know. And he was so important that to this day, they call it Silver's Temple.
They sold it. Case Western Reserve University took over. They have concerts there now and everything.
That's right. I know. Yeah.
And nobody wore a kippah at that time when I was teaching there. No men.
Of course not. Well, same with Wilshire Boulevard Temple. You were not allowed to. Now this is my last point about all these intersections of ancient, history and ritual versus contemporary issues. The Reform movement, in its own way, became maniacally orthodox in its anti-traditional ritual. Not only do you not have to wear a yarmulke, you're not permitted to wear one in our sanctuary. Wilshire Boulevard Temple was very much like that decades ago. You were not allowed to wear a yarmulke. Ushers were instructed to ask people to remove them. So that...
How could that be
all
accepted,
that. I
though,
think it's time for
seriously?
Rabbi Eshel to hold forth. Yeah.
How could you justify that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
How could you justify that on any level?
You can
when it comes
justify
to your own expression of your beliefs and righteousness and the actions and free will, I mean, that to me seems very, very restrictive.
Well,
I got yelled at for wearing a tallis in the sanctuary at Wilshire years ago. I mean, we're talking 20 some odd years ago.
Well,
by a congregant, not by one of the rabbis.
I remember.
Congregant.
I remember hearing.
You can't justify it, but it did, but it was the way.
Yeah.
I remember hearing Rabbi Gurney on high holidays, and this is probably the reason he was against it. He said, "You people give to the Orthodox community, and they don't agree with anything we do, and they don't accept us as Jews. So therefore, your money isn't kosher. You shouldn't give it to them."
Who said that?
Edgar Magnin on high holidays.
This was post Rabbi Magnin when it happened to me.
Well, this was.
Oh no, that lasted for a long time.
This is why he was against, I think, talit and yarmulkes for the same
absolutely.
reason.
Yes, absolutely. That's true.
Only the building was taken over by the Case Western Reserve downtown, but the new temple still exists, Silver Temple till today.
No, of course.
It's in Beechwood.
The new temple out of Beechwood. Yeah.
So that's a fabulous segue, Mark. Thank you so much. About talking about recognizing, right? Recognition and what that even means. So we're gonna move now. It was also actually a fabulous segue because Cantor Gurney was talking about this this biblical period up until the rabbinic period and all this kind of convoluted cuckoo stuff. Because we're going to talk now about this idea of matrilineal and patrilineal descent, and what does that even mean in case of. And this came up even just the other day where I was sitting at a table or sitting at a separate table. We were at a small, socially distanced. Everything was appropriate, I promise. We were outside and it was for a bat mitzvah lunch, everybody. But there were some people sitting at a separate table and said to me, Rabbi Eshel, so tell us, I mean, isn't the way that you tell if somebody is a Jew if they come from a Jewish mother, and that's it, that's it? And if they don't come from a Jewish mother, they're not Jewish. Is that correct? And I said, no, that is not correct. They said, what? Wait, but I thought everybody said, everybody knows that. That's what the thing is, right? That's what it is. But it's what's very interesting is that is a and always has been a limited way of understanding lineage and what it means to be a Jew, right? So, but even today that persists. Like people think that, right? People think that. We even had like a couple of challenges at camp one summer where, you know, because look, the community that we come from, right, in the progressive movements, you do have people where the families have one, maybe one grown up, one parent is Jewish and one parent is not. And if it's the father who is Jewish and the mother is not, what is the status of the children? And we had an incident, you know, where an Israeli counselor, not knowing, said, oh, but you're not Jewish because your mother's not Jewish, said to a kid. But this kid, you know, is grown up at Wilshire Boulevard Temple from the nursery school all the way through, identifies as Jewish, is studying for bat mitzvah and doing all those things. It's like, what? There was even, Mark, I'm sure can speak to this as well because of his connection also to Ramah, right? Just a few years ago, Mark, where there was a big issue where in the conservative movement in the Ramah camps where they were making these declarations of who's a camper and who cannot be a camper based on this matrilineal descent, which is fascinating that there would even be such a thing as matrilineal descent when it comes to this, when everything else in the tradition.
Could you say that again, Rabbi? I think I missed that. What did you say?
It's everything else, patrilineal descent. Now, here's the interesting part. The matrilineal descent is not a Torah law. Matrilineal descent is not a Torah law. In Torah, it's still patrilineal descent. In Torah law, it's patrilineal. Even through the time of Ezra and beyond, it's patrilineal descent, right? Determining the status of the children, because you have all these like the children of the kings of Israel at the time, right? They were marrying the non-Jewish. They had non-Jewish wives, but their children were still, you know, considered Jewish, unquestionably Jewish. They were still in line for, you know, throne and all of this kind of stuff, right? Even right, the Davidic line, right, with Boaz and Ruth, because they say, oh, Ruth was the first convert. So what did she do to convert? She said, I'm with this guy, right? I'm with this woman. Where you go, I'm going. I'm hanging out with you. So what is that? That is just one's declaration and taking one's declaration into consideration to say, so by that account, anybody could say, well, I'm Jewish. So hold on, Jeff, I'm getting somewhere. Then I got you. Okay? By that account, you can say I'm Jewish. So you really don't see this until the infamous, the rabbis, right? Where everything other than this was going to be considered patrilineal descent. This was the only thing to tell if somebody was Jewish, if a kid was Jewish, and we're talking about the males only. The girls, they were like, oh, whatever. Even though they would still be the ones to make the decision, right? Or to make the yichut, right? Or the yichis. That's where the word yichis comes from, right? Of the children. So what's going on during these times? All the warring and the struggles and the fighting with neighboring lands. What was happening? Right? What was happening? There was mixing, and by force, right? Force mixing. But what was the thing? Right? What was the issue is you could, at this time, you could always know, or you can always tell who the mother was, right, in birth. But you couldn't prove necessarily, or we can always tell who the father was, right? I mean, it's a little different from my children because they look exactly like me. But, right, when that's not the case, you couldn't always tell. So, of course, you're like, well, We have to take care of our own, and we have to take care of ourselves here, right? So, but what's very interesting, so it's during this time, right, that the Mishnaic and the Talmudic authorities start changing the biblical laws, right? They start changing the biblical laws. But even in changing the biblical laws, right, where they were more focused on this, on the mother, because of the fighting and the wars and all of those kind of things. When mixing was not because of the wars and but because of expansion, even in the Mishnah and even the Mishnaic and the Talmudic rabbis were open to revising their own laws, right? Revising their own laws. When certain marriages were perhaps initially not appropriate. Coming, where are we coming?
Hang on.
Oh, I'm hanging.
Is that you, David?
It is me. Sukasa, what is she doing?
Tom, you
All right, I'm muting you, Sue.
Mutifier. Thank you.
Good. Okay, Jeff, question. That was a fabulous segue to a question. Go.
Let's look at the entirety of the beginning of our history, and what does it mean that the Brit or the covenant involved only men? Women did not attain that status of covenant. They couldn't.
Right. So, we talked about that last week. Was that last week?
No.
We talked about that recently with Torah study.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we did.
Okay. But the idea that for thousands of years, the genetics of how the family handed down the rites of passage, the inheritance, the control of the clan, all stemmed genetically from the father in that segment. The mother, played her role, but ultimately it was still this covenantal establishment through the brit and circumcision with the men. So
that must have come later.
No, that was the very beginning. I mean, with Abraham, the first established difference between him and the pagans was that he circumcised himself to God. The women weren't included in this ceremony. They don't have a ceremony, or they don't have a separate covenant. And, I won't say anything more about that because they are equal in my eyes to any man. But their role is even more important, more or less. I don't know where I'm going with the rest of that question, but it seems like the establishment of Judaism and the lineage of Judaism has always, been in my limited exposure, a male transmission.
So, so this is where things start, to evolve and change, right? When we talk about the Reform movement. Right? If we are talking about real equality and egalitarianism in the Reform movement, right, then this needs to apply just as much, right? That this needs to apply just as much. But what is fascinating about the Reform movement is that we are actually stricter, at least in our principles, right? Our stated principles. We are stricter than traditional Jews or Orthodox Jews when it comes to identification, because it's not true just to say that if a mother is Jewish, then the kid's Jewish. If a father is Jewish, the kid's Jewish. There also has to be communal expression and participation by said child and family, right? It's not just, oh, it just so happens, but the kid grows up and goes to church every Sunday, and only thing they know that maybe, dad was Jewish once or something like that, but that's fine. No, the Reform movement does not necessarily accept that person, boom, as Jewish. They have to actually do something about it. They actually have to do the Jewish, right? So that's very interesting. Then, and I'm really just kind of glossing over a couple of things because I also, Roy had that very interesting question about excommunication. So it actually comes up in 1962 with somebody, if you're familiar with the case in Israel of Brother Daniel. Does this sound familiar to anybody? To Brother Daniel. Okay, so Brother Daniel, like he was a practicing priest, right? A practicing priest who wanted to make Aliyah to Israel, right? Who wanted to make Aliyah to Israel in 1962, because he actually had a Jewish mother, right? Brother Daniel actually had a Jewish mother, but the ruling was such that because he openly and purely practiced a different religion, he was no longer considered Jewish, right? He was an apostate. He was excommunicated, right? This is like a modern day understanding. And then when we talk about Aliyah to Israel, right, which is so interesting, in the beginning of the state, right, in the beginning of the state, and so in like in the early 1950s, one only had to declare one's Jewishness without even having to check a grandparents, your parents, any of those. You just had to declare your Judaism, and that was enough, right? But that did not sit well with the Rabbanut, or the rabbinic assembly, the rabbinic courts in Israel. But at the time, they were not very big or strong, right? But as they grew in power and were given more authority, right? As they were given more power, still, like in Israel, with the leadership saying, these guys, the religious, we're going to keep that separate from the secular. It's quickly started to merge, right? So where now, which is very interesting, in the 1970s, the law changed again, right? Or there was an amendment to the law, right? That law is still there from the early 1950s, but the amendment is there now in 1970s, which says, right, in matters of being recognized as Jewish, okay, the person needs to be born of a Jewish mother or gone through conversion to Judaism. Now, which is very interesting, but this is only, okay, because there's two different issues here. This is only in terms of having the word Yehud on your ID card. This is only in terms of having the word Yehud on your ID card, okay? And where there is still a fight, where the Orthodox in Israel want to include in this law, the way it is written, halachically supervised conversion, because that is not there, which means that the conversions that are done through other movements, which is interesting because it's only recognized in the States, not in Israel, the conversion of progressive movements, but if you do through a progressive movement or a non-Orthodox movement conversion, it still counts, right? Though the Orthodox are still up in arms about this. However, this is not the same as the law of return, okay? It's two distinctions here. To qualify for the law of return, for those of you who don't know the law of return, is that somebody who is Jewish can make Aliyah, who can move to Israel and receive citizenship right away. Okay, the law of return states that that one of your grandparents needs to be Jewish. One of your grandparents needs to be Jewish. Doesn't say what grandparent, does it? So, and what does that mirror? Does anybody remember or know what does that mirror? It's kind of dark. What does that mirror? Lori? You're
has
muted.
to do with Holocaust identification of Jews.
Lori, what happened to your voice? What
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lori. Isn't that what Hitler used to determine who was a Jew?
Yes, beautiful. Well, not beautiful, but yes, that is correct. So basically the idea is, well, if Hitler was going to kill you for being a Jew, in this case, we're going to let you in for being a Jew, right? And it had to do, but if you could not produce, right, like your parents' ketubah, or to prove that your mother, quote unquote, prove that your mother is Jewish, right, you couldn't have Yehud on your Teudat Zot or your ID card, right? You'll still be a citizen, but you couldn't have that on your ID card, which is very interesting. So because, right, here's the thing, even in the Rabbanut, they had to also adapt because of the changing, the landscape, with the influx of, over 1 million people from the former Soviet Union in the 90s, right? Over 1 million people. You're coming to a country that was at the time 6 million people. Now all of a sudden to take and absorb 1 million people with this idea of having to prove Judaism. So there was a lot of openness and forgiveness in that. And then you have with the Ethiopians coming over as well, right? Well, what does that mean? Who is Jewish? How did you even become Jewish? What does that even mean, right? And then you have this other group here, the Karaites, right? The Karaites, who they are. It's a small group. There's maybe like 30,000 of them in Israel, and they come in from Egypt and Iraq, in Iran. Actually, it started in Persia around the 9th, 10th century. That they completely dismissed rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud and Mishnah, Talmud, all of that, the Gemara, all of that was dismissed and not seen as proper Judaism, any of the oral Torah. They were strictly biblical followers, right? If it says so in the Torah, literally in the 5 books, then that's what it is. So they very much follow patrilineal descent, right? They very much follow patrilineal descent. And then...
Did that, Rabbi, question.
Yeah.
Did that statement of Yehud on your ID also imply that you were eligible or non-eligible for all the social services in Israel?
Okay, great question. And it's not Yehud, because Yehud means like, it's Yehud, like Yehudim, right? Yehud means alone and separate.
That's what they do when a couple is getting married. They go for
when the couple's getting married. But you are no. It only, if you have that ID card, you got all the social services. You got all the social services. It was just one thing really that you could not do if you didn't have Yehud on your ID card.
Which was?
Marriage. Get
married. Because in the beginning of the state, they gave that over to the religious. And even up until recently, you couldn't choose necessarily the rabbi, even if they were Orthodox. You couldn't choose the rabbi who was going to marry you. You had to use the one from your municipality, right? So what people were doing, and so their marriages, if you wanted to get married in a progressive way, or if you wanted to even just choose your rabbi, you couldn't. You could have that person there as well, but the one from your municipality had to be there. So how are, as a way of kind of fighting against this idea, like, don't tell me who I get to declare my own religiosity, my own understanding of what it means to be Jewish. There's a thriving business now in Israel of people flying, going to, well, not right now at the moment, but going to Cyprus to get married, because marriages outside of the state are looked at as legal and binding, right? If it's done outside of the rabbinate. So there's a thriving business. Let's fly to Cyprus. It's going to be fabulous. We'll do a wedding and then we fly right back.
Right. So they have no jurisdiction over that. Yeah.
Yes, because so you can do it all in one day. So as you can see, it's not so cut and dry, pun not intended, of who is Jewish or not. Of who is Jewish, and if it being matrilineal or patrilineal descent, right? It's not, because it's not from the Torah. It's not biblical. It's not even, all the way up until the 2nd century that you even see the beginnings of this idea. And even within those ideas, there were always loopholes. There were always arguments, considerations. What if the marriage changed? What if, all sorts of different things. So, unfortunately, we are out of time. Very sad to say. Jeff, you have one more question before we finish?
Well, just an inquiry as to the thinking that it might represent.
Bring.
You know, we talked about the Brit for men. We have nothing specific necessarily for women until about 1922, when bat mitzvah became a cultural custom, so to speak, across several of the disciplines of Judaism. Does that really represent anything for women as far as their commitments in Judaism, their recognition in Judaism?
Absolutely, I believe so. Absolutely. Why not? It's an evolution, right? It's an evolution. Even like what we even talked about the Hasidut the other day, right? They were the first, they were like the second Reformed Jews, the Hasidim, right? They were Reformed Jews. They were changing things and new interpretation and adding different ways of looking at things, different way of like exploring the secrets and all that, right? Mitnagdim were the ones who were neged, right? They got their name because they were gay. So they were just like the Reformed. It's an evolution of thought. I think it's beautiful with the bat mitzvah and brit bat, or, you know, welcoming our daughters into the covenant in this way. And then our ability to create new ritual around the ideas that are just as meaningful, right? You know, and less painful.
I would throw in there, David, too, that after the initial groundbreaking bat mitzvah of Mordechai Kaplan's daughter, Judith Kaplan, right, Eisenstein, it took another 40 years for bat mitzvah to take hold. 40 years, even in the Reform movement. 40 years in America before it became, you know, an accepted custom. So it, you know, these kind of changes take a lot of time. They move very slowly, almost like, you know, like archaeological time.
Okay, Merle, you can have the last word. Oh, well, Miriam, where did you come from? I didn't even see you.
I was on another Zoom and it lasted too long. And I
got so many Zooms. Zoom, I got that Zoom.
I do 4 a day. It's too much.
We're living on Zoom. When I was, I think, 16 or 17, my cousin, whose family also belonged to Wilshire, he wanted to have a bat mitzvah. She was the first one that Rabbi Magnin allowed to have taken place. And at that time, it was like everyone in the whole Jewish community in Los Angeles was shaking their heads like, what is this all about?
Right.
It's a whole other thing that started.
What year was that? What year was that? Do you remember?
I don't know. Do the math. I'm 71 and I was teen at the time.
All right, so, you know.
That's like 60 years.
And Rabbi Magnin was still she's like 3 years younger. Rabbi Magnin was still very involved.
Right.
And, but because of her family and money that was promised, I guess he gave in. I don't.
Yeah.
Those were the days.
I would tell you, you know, in my youth at that
next,
liberal conservative synagogue where Friday nights had musical instruments and nothing on Shabbat morning, no organ, no choir. When we first started doing bat mitzvah, this is in now, let's see, the late 60s. There weren't a lot of them, but those that did happen were Friday nights, not Shabbat morning, because those first Banot mitzvah were not allowed to read from the Torah.
I thought those were on Thursday nights.
Miriam, what do you want to say?
I just wanted to answer Jeff very quickly that I don't know if you're aware, Jeff, of what the bat mitzvah girls go through today. Very willingly so also. I'll talk about my granddaughter for a moment, who graduated from a wonderful day school, Temple Israel of Hollywood. Rabbi Rossoff was the rabbi there, and she had 6 years of a fantastic Jewish education. I know because my kids went to Hillel, and I was always comparing their education. My grandchildren spoke Hebrew much better than my own children did when they graduated from Hillel after 8 years. And I want you to know something, Jeff. Then when they get up, these girls get up on the bima, they do as much as the B'nai Mitzvah does today. They read that much from the Torah directly. without any help,
There's no
without any
distinction.
sheets, directly from the Torah, and they study as much as the boys do,
Yeah.
and they come away with a tremendous sense of identity.
And I'll tell you what, it also sounds a lot better because their voices aren't cracking. It's not quiet out there. I don't know. That's terrible. Why do that to a 13-year-old boy? Not cool.
1966, 67.
Okay.
Phyllis and Warren just shared something that sometimes there's even a lower bima for the girls. I was like, what? That's bananas.
Okay.
All right, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great
This was
pleasure to
wonderful.
share this with you. So
Thank you both.
Thank you. This is so good.
For your music.
Rabbi, is this being recorded?
It's
So
being
that I can-
recorded.
And how can I hear the part that I missed? How can I
It'll
hear
be
it?
online. It'll be on the website.
Will it be today?
Yep.
No.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, okay.
Miriam.
All right.
Miriam.